This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is Chapter 21 from Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Chapter 21, Post-Dispatch, or Absentee Landlordism. At the beginning of the year, consumed in the actual writing of this book, I had planned, as one of the concluding chapters of Part 1, a short tribute to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It was intended to be the most optimistic of the few chapters devoted to the brighter chambers in the House of Lords. The defeat of Hearst, the strictures on the present situation by William Allen White, were to be followed by the story of prosperity and absolute freedom in a great newspaper, namely the Post-Dispatch. When the newspaper The World died in 1931, journalists tried to apportion the blame. Some said it was due to Ralph Pulitzer because he had not inherited either his father's talents or enthusiasm, and because he preferred to play the role of absentee landlord, devoting himself to his clubs or his country home. Others laid the blame on Herbert Bayard Swope, the executive editor, who apparently had a deeper interest in Wall Street and Park Avenue than in Park Row, and still others blamed Walter Lippmann, the chief editorial writer, who was becoming a master of straddling, and therefore losing for the paper its great reputation of fearlessness, courage, and forthrightness. The World may not have been the great newspaper which we think it today, but it was something to measure the press by, just as the Manchester Guardian, which also is not without its faults and weaknesses, is used as a standard for Europe. In America, when the World passed out, there was satisfaction in knowing that the Pulitzer tradition would be carried on in the Post-Dispatch, and it was carried on. As late as a year ago, the only thing I intended to deplore was the fact that the Post-Dispatch was physically in St. Louis, that, despite the fact that it was great and fearless and free, it was provincial, that America being what it is geographically, it is impossible for a newspaper, although it may be the greatest in the country, to exercise a great power if its circulation is confined to a Middle Western state. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, transferred to New York or perhaps Washington, would have been the most important newspaper in America. I regret to state that considerable doubt, if not considerable disillusion, has entered the situation. Under Joseph Pulitzer's will, his youngest son, Herbert, was given 6/10 of the estate. The great publisher believed in a myth, which he thought scientific truth, namely, that the child of late years inherited the greater mental and physical vigor, while Ralph and Joseph Pulitzer got 2/10 and 1/10 respectively, the last 10th being a gift to the executives of the Post-Dispatch staff. Herbert tried his hand at journalism. In 1921, when Russia was open, he went as World correspondent and later worked in the World office in New York. But it was definitely not his métier. Ralph ran the World and ran it to death. Joseph made a great success of the Post-Dispatch. Herbert and Ralph never visited St. Louis. Joseph lived there, but in recent years he spent half his time in his country home at Bar Harbor. As Maine goes, so go the natives of Maine. In October 1936, within a few days of the election, Joseph Pulitzer returned to St. Louis to give the Post-Dispatch a final Landon spurt. That was the sentiment of Bar Harbor. It was the yacht club sentiment, the absentee landlord sentiment. Some time earlier, the Post-Dispatch had abandoned the Democratic Party policy, ceased its support of President Roosevelt and the New Deal. But unlike the Baltimore Sun, it did not straddle the issue of supporting Landon fervently. It also raised the shout that the president was growing dictatorial. It accused him of dangerously centralizing governmental power over the economic life of the country. Writes Paul Anderson, quote, "To what extent the absentee owners dictate the policy of the paper has always been a mystery to its employees. There is no doubt, however, that all three brothers concurred in the decision to desert the New Deal. Since that time, the policy of the paper has steadily become more conservative, more on the side of property rights and the vested interests," unquote. In fact, the abandonment of liberalism occurred 2 years earlier, in 1934, Anderson states, when the late Clark McAdams was demoted as editor of the editorial page. McAdams was a liberal and a crusader. He was 100% for the New Deal. This is my one regret in reading through this work, is that George Seldes was so enamored with the New Deal. And I'll say it one more time. Neither the conservatives, just like today, neither the so-called conservatives nor the so-called liberals are right here. It's all a shell game. And the fact of the matter is that the same Wall Street financiers who backed FDR also backed the Bolshevik Revolution, and they also backed Hitler. And that's unfortunately irrefutable historical truth, though very suppressed. One of the best confirmations on that comes from the many writings, voluminous research of Anthony C. Sutton. Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Wall Street and FDR, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, those three titles. And he's got a lot more, but those three are the salient ones here. So, but this book nevertheless is valuable because Seldes is exposing the corruption of the papers, the corruption of the media, even back in the 1930s, and tangentially, occasionally, he's exposing the overwhelming power to censor the news that Rome wields in this nation. Continuing. The brothers Pulitzer and their yachts, their clubs, and their palaces had begun to waver. If it is wrong to create personal devils, it may be just as bad to make personal heroes. Newspapers are not only the prolongation of the characters of their owners, but of the forces which are stronger than men. And when they are good or bad, liberal or conservative, pro-public or pro-public utility, it is due to a combination of many things, material and psychological and whatnot. For many decades, the Post-Dispatch was an ideal newspaper. Whatever mistakes it made were human errors, of which journals, as well as men, are capable. They were not actions dictated by an owner serving outside interests or, at the very best, his own egotism. Venality never entered the doors of the editorial sanctum. The best proof that the Post-Dispatch was a free newspaper was the angry report of the Missouri head of the Propaganda Bureau, operated by the National Electric Light Association, in which he complained that he had not been able to corrupt this newspaper. He did claim that he had, quote-unquote, reached All the other daily and weekly publications in the state, some 700, and failed only in this one instance. It is probable that there were a few other publications which refused part of the $25 million a year Public Utility Corruption Fund, but it is unquestioned that the Post-Dispatch angrily threw the propagandists and their money out of the office. Parenthesis. In the case of several Chicago, New York, and other great dailies, the NELA probably did not corrupt by buying advertising space, but their propaganda was used willingly by editors. This is not corruption. This is part of the big business finance system under which we live. End parenthesis. Refusal to be bribed is negative. The Post-Dispatch went after the corrupting elements. It fought them in every field in which they existed, from national politics to petty racketeering. Take Teapot Dome, for instance. I have given credit to Carl McGee of Albuquerque for unearthing the scandal when he followed his feud with Secretary Fall. McGee unearthed the scandal, but it was the Post-Dispatch which forced the investigation of the Ohio gang by producing enough evidence to make the attempt by the New York Times, Washington Post, Philadelphia Public Ledger, and other conservative big business newspapers to squash it look ridiculous. It was Paul Y. Anderson, Washington correspondent of the Post-Dispatch, who gave the Teapot Dome scandal air after the Ohio gang had succeeded in silencing the first reports of vast corruption. It was also Mr. Anderson who, in 1927, exposed the State Department for fostering a Red Scare in Mexico on behalf of the American oil corporations, which wanted an excuse for invasion and inevitable war and annexation. It was also Anderson who exposed the Chicago police as guilty of massacre in the notorious Republic Steel Company Memorial Day rioting, which the Chicago Tribune had defended. And it was John Rogers who exposed Lingle, the Chicago Tribune reporter, as a racketeer, and it was Rogers who helped get the evidence in many other great exposés. I could go on for pages telling stories of what reporters of the Post-Dispatch have done, all the way from exposing the political corruption such as the Pendergast machine, the Kelly machine, the Hague machine, down to some local kidnapping which involved no political party and no big money. The Ku Klux Klan was exposed by the Pulitzer papers first. Federal Judge George W. English was impeached by the Post-Dispatch, and something of a like nature was happening every week in St. Louis. All this work, it got the Post-Dispatch the reputation of being the outstanding, quote-unquote, crusading newspaper in America. But its managing editor denies the predicate adjective was done under the direction of Oliver K. Bovard. Quote, honor where honor is due, unquote, Anderson wrote as a valedictory to the most famous managing editor in America. Quote, for most of the distinctions which have come to Post-Dispatch men, Bovard is entitled to a large share of the credit. He would show a reporter how to pull off a terrific story, and then insist that the reporter be given a salary increase for pulling it. If there was anything on which he set more store than professional skill, good craftsmanship, it was the truth. And when I say truth, I mean precision and exactitude to the limit of human performance, He would fire a man for failing to get a middle initial or getting it wrong. In the larger aspects of truth, he was even more severe." Unquote. Bouvard made it his business to eliminate the barriers between news and truth. It is news, for example, that a Ku Klux Klan parade took place, or that Kluxers burned a fiery cross, or that they committed a certain crime. That is all surface news. Behind it is the news of who the leaders are, how they organize, what financial interests are involved, what their objectives are, what the social, economic, and political significances are. And in Bouvard's opinion, the news behind the news was the real story, the true story. The newspaper that went out attacking corruption was all right. It was a crusading newspaper. It did the public a service. But the newspaper that disregarded all the corrupting forces, notably the big money, and in addition to the surface facts, published the hidden facts, the cause of the effect, that was a true newspaper, and not at all a crusading newspaper. That was Bouvard's idea, and he made it work for almost 40 years. The more he saw of the pressures which change policies, the more determined he was to keep away from all contact with men and forces which might influence his one policy, to tell the real story. He saw fellow editors joining clubs, flitting about in society. He saw a noted columnist playing polo. He found a noted colleague giving more attention to his Wall Street investments than his editorial page, and it made him more determined than ever to steer clear of entangling alliances. He avoided associations, quote, which might embarrass him in his single-minded determination to get and print all the news, unquote. For a quarter of a century, Bouvard, says Anderson, exercised as much influence on the daily lives of St. Louisans as any individual in the city. He also exercised an influence on the journalism of the nation. If honor goes to Bouvard for the great work, for which 2 of his reporters won Pulitzer Prizes, and for publishing a really free and uncensored newspaper, uncensored by publishers, advertisers, or the spirit of the times, then, in turn, there must be honor for the owners of a big property which can permit this freedom. Therefore, the 3 Pulitzer sons, Herbert, Ralph, and Joseph, and especially Joseph, who is editor and publisher, were deserving of great honor. But after 30 years of stamping his character and ideals on the Post-Dispatch, O.K. Bouvard, on the 1st of August, 1938, posted a notice on the bulletin board saying, quote, "To the staff, with regret I have to tell you that I have resigned because of irreconcilable differences of opinion with Mr. Pulitzer as to the general conduct of the paper, and am leaving the office August 13th. I recognize and respect the rights and responsibilities of ownership and make no complaint. I salute you, a splendid body of men, and an exceptional newspaper staff." Unquote. On another occasion, Bouvard had also electrified his staff with one of his bulletin board notices. On election night, 1936, when the electoral vote avalanche spoke for Roosevelt, he wrote this announcement: "The Country, 523. The Country Club, 8. Can there possibly be any relationship between these 2 bulletin board notices of 1936 and 1938? Anderson, who now represents the St. Louis Star-Times in Washington, says that, quote, In recent years, Bouvard has been taking a deep interest in politics and economics. He has studied the great economics, not forgetting one named Karl Marx, and he has made several visits to Russia to see how the theory was working out. During these years, members of the Post-Dispatch staff received a distinct impression that Joseph Pulitzer was torn by conflicting emotions. Apprehension over the deepening quote-unquote radicalism of his managing editor, and fear that the paper could not survive without him, unquote. Mr. Pulitzer referred to, quote, honest differences of opinion, unquote, when he accepted Bouvard's resignation, which referred to, quote, irreconcilable differences of opinion with Mr. Pulitzer, unquote. No other statement was forthcoming, but Mr. Anderson says, quote, the nature of those differences is no secret. They are economic and political, unquote. The Post-Dispatch has grown more and more concerned with property rights and the vested interests. Naturally, honest differences of opinion have become irreconcilable differences, and the most distinguished managing editor in America resigned because he could no longer maintain his policy, which was inimical to the special interests. The tragedy is all the greater because, in all discussions of a free press up to now, it was customary to point to the Post-Dispatch as the almost unique example of prosperity accompanying a policy of public welfare. Following Mr. Bouvard's resignation, the entire staff rushed into the newspaper guild. Previously, a large number of reporters, owing to some mistaken sense of loyalty, had refrained from joining. To New York guildsmen, Bouvard made a statement which had a thundering effect throughout the country. Quote, it's inevitable, why discuss it, unquote, he said of the guild shop. As for the guild itself, he said it, quote, has proved a good thing for newspaper men. The need for it is obvious. I think it may also prove to be a good thing for newspapers. The ideals of newspapers, which the mass of newspaper men hold, are high. Because of this, I look for the guild to become in time influential in elevating the tone of the press as a whole, to aid in making it more journalistic and less commercial, unquote. On his way to Europe for his first real holiday in 40 years, Bouvard was captured by my friend Kyle Crichton and taken to my apartment, where we argued freedom of the press until 4 a.m. Mr. Bouvard went away, still maintaining that it is possible, under the present economic system, to run a wholly free newspaper which will make money despite all social, economic, and other pressures. He said he spoke from practical experience. Okay, folks, that was Chapter 21 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. We will be back with Chapter 22 in a few. We are back. And this is Chapter 22 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. Chapter 22, William Allen White, Anti-Press Lord. The most outstanding figure in American journalism is William Allen White of Emporia, Kansas. He is not a press lord. He is a small-town editor and publisher. It is perhaps the most unfortunate thing in our modern newspaper history that White chose to remain in Kansas. If he had accepted an editorship in New York or Chicago or St. Louis, and produced a national newspaper as honest, sincere, liberal, and altogether free as his Emporia Gazette, it would have been the greatest achievement of our journalistic times. As it is, William Allen White himself is a national figure, but his newspaper has no influence outside Kansas. Emporia's gain is America's loss. What are Mr. White's views on the newspaper problem in America today? He believes that the press has become too commercial. He sees that it is losing its influence because it is not keeping faith with the people. He notes the conflict of labor and capital, and finds that capitalism has gotten control of our press. In fact, Mr. White at times goes further in his criticism and strictures on our press and on our press lords than the present writer does. And since he is the president of the Society of Newspaper Editors and dean of American publishers, it might pay us to listen to his exact words. The curse of wealth. In a letter to Alfred Lee for his History of American Journalism, Mr. White says the real threat to freedom of the press lies in the publishers themselves. He continues, quote, "Too often the publisher of an American newspaper has made his money in some other calling than journalism. He is a rich man seeking power and prestige. He has the country club complex. The business manager of this absentee owner quickly is afflicted with the country club point of view. Soon the managing editor's wife puts him in the country club, and then the city editor's wife nags him into it. And they all get the unconscious arrogance of conscious wealth. Therefore, it is hard to get a modern American newspaper to go the distance necessary to print all the news about many topics. On the whole, sooner or later, in the long run, the American people do get the truth, but they often get it when it is cold potatoes and does them no good," unquote. Mr. Lee suggests that, quote, "Some would substitute, in the case of employees, the conscious arrogance of expected wealth for the unconscious arrogance of conscious wealth. It would be a little more accurate," unquote. This conscious arrogance of expected wealth is particularly noticeable in the Scripps Howard United Press organization. Favors the newspaper guild. Most of the publishers hate the newspaper guild and fight labor unionization generally. Mr. White takes an opposite stand, quote, "I believe the union principle is right, and I don't feel the coming of the union, even a vertical union, in the newspaper business will affect the freedom of the press. As a matter of fact, it will be God's unmixed blessing if the newspaper owner who generally buys a newspaper for social or business reasons can feel at the back of his neck the hot breath of the disapproval of the force when he gets too class-conscious, when he goes too obviously country-clubby, and too strongly pro-clearinghouse and chamber of commerce in his proprietary attitude. After all, Jesus had the goods on the rich man," unquote. Of the conflict between the House of Lords and the Guild, Mr. White says, quote, "It was a typical conflict. It is the conflict between ownership and public interest. It is the gist of all the issues that will come up during your whole life. There is something, indeed there is much to be said for ownership, but ownership without a considerable consideration of public interest is probably going to be decided by the American people to be an archaic hangover from feudalism, unquote. Free press enemy, commercialism. Mr. White was the first of the owners to admit that commercialism means the ruin of a free press. When Munsey, who wrecked many great papers which were inimical to big money, died in 1925, White wrote, quote, "Frank Munsey, the great publisher, is dead. Frank Munsey contributed to the journalism of his day the talent of a meat packer, the morals of a money changer, and the manners of an undertaker. He and his kind have about succeeded in transforming a once noble profession into an 8% security. May he rest in trust," unquote. For the past decade, Mr. White has spoken more and more bitterly and openly against the money power in journalism. He is almost unique among publishers in admitting that the press is not only commercial, but a part of the ruling capitalist world. In the past 30 years, he says, newspapers, quote, "have veered from their traditional position as leaders of public opinion into mere peddlers and purveyors of news." That's what we have today. The newspapers have become commercial enterprises and hence fall into the current which is merging commercial enterprises along mercantile lines. As the newspaper's interest has become a mercantile or industrial proposition, the dangers of commercial corruption of the press has become greater and greater. The power trust, of course, is buying the newspapers in order to control the old vestige of leadership, the remaining fragment of professional status that still remains in the newspaper business. As a commercial enterprise, the newspaper is yielding good returns for investment. But as a political weapon, it is worth to self-seeking service corporations hundreds of dollars in undercover influence, where it is worth dollars in direct returns. If this country turns from a democracy into a Hamiltonian plutocracy, it will be because the moral sense, moral intelligence, and moral courage of the American people are sapped at the roots by insidiously corrupt plutocratic influence, he's calling it like it is, undermining the sources of courage and intelligence which have been so ably represented by the American press in other generations. Unless democracy is indignant at the encroachments of plutocracy, democracy cannot fight. When plutocracy destroys the sources of information which should make indignation, plutocracy has paralyzed democracy. But it is no sudden thing. It is a part of the tendency of the times. I do not know the answer, unquote. Hear, hear. The reader may note a progression of thought in the foregoing quotations from the writings and speeches of the foremost journalistic figure in America. William Allen White is no longer a young man. He has, in fact, grown gray in the service. And although he has not grown rich, he has at least become comfortably well off, and it would be more natural to find him growing more and more conservative in his views. In 1936, when he supported a fellow Kansan named Alf Landon for the presidency, there were in fact many who saw it as a sign of the old reactionary spirit which comes with comfort and gray hairs. But all these suppositions are not true. As he has grown older, Mr. White has grown more free-minded. His enemies would call it radical, but that really does not matter on the subject of American journalism. And in 1938, while this book was being written, Mr. White, who had just been elected president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, said, in an address to the students of the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, "Many things about our lords of the press which equal and perhaps surpass in severity all the criticisms made in this book. The menace is capital. Publishing is a business, he began, a legitimate business, quote, which in certain of its higher realms may be reasonably called big business, unquote. He traced its three distinct periods. The first was pre-Civil War years, when a printer or anyone with a few dollars could publish a newspaper. 50 years ago or so, publishing became a quote-unquote profession, but money was needed to indulge in it. Not much, but a little, and the editor belonged to the ruling class. He was a free man, ran a free press, quote, restricted only by his courage, his honesty, and his intelligence. No outside influence restrained his powers, unquote. The machine age arrived with the turn of the century. Advertising became one of the big influences in America, and, quote, the trade which had become a profession turned into a business, and there it is today, unquote. It now requires capital to start and run newspapers, even in small towns. And now Mr. White comes to the crux of the newspaper problem. Quote, capital today or tomorrow always has a lively sense of its own advantage. Capital is instinctively, for all the noble intentions of us capitalists, class conscious. It is that class consciousness which is discrediting the press of the world today, particularly the press of the English-speaking democracies. Any newspaper in any American town represents a considerable lot of capital for the size of the town. The owners of newspaper investments, whether they be bankers, stockholders of a corporation, or individuals, feel a rather keen sense of financial responsibility, and they pass their anxiety along to newspaper operatives, whether these operatives be superintendents, known as managing editors, foremen, known as city editors, or mere wage earners, known as editorial writers, copy desk men, reporters, or what not. The sense of property goes thrilling down the line. It produces a slant and a bias that in time becomes, unconsciously and probably in all honesty is, a prejudice against any man or anything or any cause that seriously affects the right, title, and interests of any other capital, however invested. We editors realize that we have lost caste with the American people. We are on the bad books of the public esteem. Labor as a class distrusts us. It wouldn't distrust us without reason. The labor press sneers at us, that is to say, those class-conscious newspapers that are circulated entirely in what is known as labor circles. The deficiencies of American journals in treating the news of what we might as well frankly, if regretfully, call the class struggle in this country, are found largely in unconscious political attitudes. It is so easy to policy the news. Indeed, it is hard not to policy the news when the news is affected with a vital bread and butter interest to the capitalist who controls a newspaper, great or small. And, strangely enough, capital is so fluid that a threat to the safety of any investment seems to be a threat to all investments. Therefore, newspapers which represent sizable investments are tempted to shy off and shiver when in Congress, in the legislature, or in the city hall, a man or a group threatens an investigation in any kind of patent medicine, in any kind of holding company, in any kind of misbranded food, in any kind of railroad security, in any kind of banking affiliate, good or bad. It is not longer the advertiser who puts on the pressure. It is not even the boss back of the payroll who begins to quake. It is the whole middle and upper structure of society. Sooner or later, the truth about any social abuse is gladly received by the middle class and by those who own and control newspaper investments. But off the bat, the newspapers representing the innate conservatism of property interests, which crystallize middle-class psychology, are sometimes unfair in their treatment of men or movements that threaten to disturb property in any form, which is only another way of saying that every new day produces its own peculiar threats to liberty. The new menace to the freedom of the press, a menace in this country vastly more acute than the menace from government, may come through the pressure not of one group of advertisers, but of a wide sector of newspaper advertisers. There it is, folks. He's calling it like it is. It's exactly, that's it. Once you get advertisement into financing papers or media, commercials financing Fox News or CNN News, right? Once you get that, truth goes out the window. That's what he's saying back in 1938. Right on. Newspaper advertising is now placed somewhat, if not largely, through nationwide advertising agencies. Some of these agencies have lately become advertisers of great industrial corporations which also advertise. These advertising agencies undertake to protect their clients from what the clients and agents may regard as real dangers from inimical social, political, or industrial influences. As advisors, the advertising agencies may exercise unbelievably powerful pressure upon newspapers. There is grave danger that in the coming decade, as social, industrial, and economic problems become more and more acute, this capacity for organized control of newspaper opinions through the political advisors of national advertisers, who in turn are paid to control public opinion, may constitute a new threat to the freedom of the press." Unquote. Mr. White interrupts his indictment with references to what he considers another, quote, black mark against editorial judgment, unquote. The overplaying of sensational news to please the circulation department, which he considers, quote, as dangerous as the advertising department in menacing the ultimate freedom of the press, unquote. The opposite side of this picture is the underplaying of constructive news, such as, for example, the Scandinavian Neutrality Pact. It is true that it is a desire for circulation, which means more advertising, which means more money, that motivates this handling of news. But, in this writer's opinion, this is a situation which is easily remedial, since it is not forced upon the publisher by outside pressure. It is merely a gesture to the mob. Mr. White concludes, quote, "The problem of the American newspaper today is to open its channels to new social ideas and to ensure fair treatment for any reformer who is obviously honest, reasonably intelligent, and backed by any considerable minority of the public. How can this be done? How can the newspapers become open-minded? I don't know. They might try to hire as doorkeepers in the house of the Lord, on copy desks, and in editorial chairs, men who are free to make decisions, not controlled by an itch to move to the next higher desk by pleasing his high potency who sits in the mahogany-paneled room in front of the front office." If owners would encourage a little chronic arthritis of the knee in the lower realms of reporting and copy reading, we might come out from the clouds of suspicion that envelop our noble profession at the moment. But I suppose in the end newspapers cannot be free, absolutely free in the highest and best sense, until the whole social and economic structure of American life is open to the free interplay of democratic processes. Mr. White here says about the last word, we have no free press, and we cannot have a free press so long as, quote, the sense of property goes thrilling down the line, unquote, of capital investment. So long as, quote, capital is so fluid that the threat to the safety of any investment seems to be a threat to all investment, unquote. The obvious thing is to change the world, quote unquote. That may take some time. But meanwhile, in the third part of this volume, some more or less practical, non-idealistic ways of helping produce a better, if not a free press, will be mentioned. All right, folks, you've been listening to chapters 21 and 22 from Lords of the Press by George Seldes. Looks like next time the book is divided. Next time we get into part 2, Servants of the Lords of the Press. Okay, that's coming up next time. All right, this book again is from 1938. It's the most decrepit book I've ever held, I think. Definitely the most decrepit I've ever pulled out of a library, and I really had to search through libraries to find this. Okay, this has been Rejected Knowledge, folks. Thanks for listening.